Something went seriously wrong at the first race of the 2026 Formula One season. The Australian Grand Prix was supposed to launch a brand new era of Formula One. New engines, new technology, new rules designed to make racing even more exciting. But instead, Melbourne may have exposed a huge problem. Because right after the race, several Formula One drivers exploded with criticism toward the FIA and the new regulations. Drivers are calling the racing artificial. They are warning about dangerous speed differences between cars. And some believe the new system could eventually lead to a major accident if nothing changes. During the race in Australia, drivers reported closing speeds between cars of 30 to 50 kilometers per hour, simply because one driver was deploying full electrical power while another was saving battery. In Formula One, that kind of difference is massive. It can turn a normal overtake into a completely unpredictable situation. Lando Norris described the race as chaotic and unnatural. Max Verstappen compared the direction of Formula One to something closer to Formula E with steroids. And several other drivers admitted that the cars now feel more like energy management machines than pure racing cars. Which leaves the FIA in an extremely uncomfortable position. Because these rules were designed to define the entire future of Formula One. Teams invested hundreds of millions of dollars developing these cars. Manufacturers built completely new hybrid engines around this concept. And yet, after just one race in Melbourne, the paddock is already asking a very serious question. Did the FIA push the regulations too far? Because what happened during the Australian Grand Prix might not just be a chaotic race. It might be the first warning sign that the new era of Formula One is heading into dangerous territory. What shocked many drivers in Melbourne was not just the chaos of the race. It was how unpredictable the cars suddenly felt once the energy systems started influencing the battles on track. Because the moment the lights went out in Australia, drivers immediately realized something unusual was happening. Cars were no longer behaving in a consistent way during overtakes. One moment, a driver could be defending normally. The next moment, another car would appear behind with a massive burst of electrical power, closing the gap at an incredible speed, sometimes in just a few seconds. And the reason was simple. The new power units rely much more heavily on electrical deployment than previous generations. That means when one driver has energy available in the battery and another driver is trying to recharge it, the speed difference can become enormous. This is exactly what drivers started experiencing throughout the Australian Grand Prix. Cars overtaking each other again and again on the straights. Not because of superior driving. Not because of better tires. But because the energy deployment cycles kept changing from one lap to the next. For some fans watching the race, it looked exciting. Constant overtakes. Constant movement. But inside the cockpit, many drivers felt something very different. They felt like the racing was no longer entirely under their control. Lando Norris explained that sometimes the situation felt almost random. You could defend perfectly through the corners. You could position the car exactly where you wanted. And then suddenly another car would pass you with a huge speed advantage simply because their energy system released more power at that moment. For drivers who spend their entire careers mastering control of the car, that kind of unpredictability is extremely frustrating. But the bigger concern is safety. Because when energy deployment creates sudden speed differences between cars, drivers have far less time to react. At Formula One speeds, even a small change in closing speed can create a dangerous situation. Now imagine a difference of 40 or 50 kilometers per hour between two cars approaching a braking zone. That is exactly the scenario some drivers experienced in Melbourne. And that is why several of them warned that if the system continues to behave this way, it could eventually lead to a serious accident. Max Verstappen has been warning about this kind of scenario long before the season even started. When the regulations were first announced, he questioned whether the direction of the sport was moving too far toward energy management instead of pure racing. After the race in Australia, he repeated those concerns again. According to Verstappen, the new generation of cars forces drivers to constantly think about battery levels and deployment strategies. Instead of simply attacking the lap at full speed. Instead of focusing purely on racing. And that shift changes the entire feeling of driving a Formula One car. For decades, the identity of Formula One has been built around one idea. The fastest drivers pushing the fastest machines to the absolute limit. But with the new regulations, that limit is no longer defined only by the driver. It is defined by the energy system. And after what happened during the Australian Grand Prix, that reality is now creating one of the most intense debates Formula One has seen in years. Because if the problems drivers experienced in Melbourne continue in the next races, the pressure on the FIA to react will grow very quickly. But the energy system is not the only part of the new regulations creating problems. Because another issue quickly became clear during the Australian Grand Prix: the balance and behavior of the cars themselves. Under the 2026 regulations, Formula One cars rely less on pure aerodynamic grip and much more on the hybrid system for performance. That means drivers are now dealing with machines that behave very differently compared to previous generations. Less downforce in fast corners, more weight from the complex hybrid systems, and a car that can suddenly change its balance depending on how the energy is being deployed or harvested. Several drivers admitted that the cars feel more nervous at high speed, especially on circuits like Albert Park, where there are long acceleration zones but not many heavy braking areas to recharge the battery naturally. In those situations, drivers are often forced to manage energy much more aggressively. They lift earlier. They coast before corners. They try to keep the battery within the correct operating window. And that completely changes the rhythm of driving a Formula One car. Instead of attacking every corner flat out, drivers are constantly thinking about energy management. Lewis Hamilton warned about this scenario long before the regulations even arrived. He explained that some simulations suggested drivers might need to lift the throttle hundreds of meters before certain corners simply to keep the battery balanced. For many drivers, that feels completely unnatural in a Formula One car. Nico Hülkenberg also highlighted another concern. The cars are expected to lose aerodynamic grip in fast corners while still remaining relatively heavy. That combination can make the cars feel unstable and difficult to control, especially at very high speeds. And the weight itself continues to be a major topic of criticism inside the paddock. The regulations aim to reduce the minimum weight slightly, but many drivers believe the reduction is too small to compensate for the complexity of the new hybrid systems, which means the cars may still feel heavy, while also losing some of the aerodynamic grip drivers rely on for confidence in fast corners. For drivers like Fernando Alonso and Max Verstappen, this combination raises an uncomfortable question. What exactly should a Formula One car feel like? For decades, the answer has been simple: extremely fast, extremely light, and capable of being pushed to the absolute limit every lap. But the 2026 regulations introduce a different philosophy: more efficiency, more hybrid technology, more strategic energy management. From an engineering perspective, it is incredibly advanced. But from a driving perspective, some drivers believe the sport may be losing part of its identity. And that is exactly why the debate inside the paddock has become so intense after the Australian Grand Prix. Because this is not just about one chaotic race. This is about the direction of Formula One itself. If the new regulations continue producing the kind of racing we saw in Melbourne, with huge speed differences, constant energy management, and unpredictable overtakes, then the FIA may face enormous pressure to adjust the system, not to completely rewrite the regulations. That would be almost impossible after teams have invested hundreds of millions into these cars. But smaller changes could still happen. Limits on certain energy deployment modes, adjustments to the active aerodynamic systems, or technical directives designed to smooth out the most extreme situations. Because the last thing Formula One wants is for the first season of a brand new era to be defined by controversy. Yet after only one race in Australia, that controversy has already begun. And if the same problems appear again in the next races, the pressure on the FIA will grow much stronger. But perhaps the biggest problem for the FIA right now is not the technical side. It is the reaction from the drivers themselves. Because when a new era of Formula One begins, some criticism is always expected. New engines arrive, new aerodynamics, new systems that teams and drivers must learn to understand. But what happened after the Australian Grand Prix was different. The tone of the criticism was much stronger than usual. Several drivers did not just say the cars were difficult to drive. They said the racing itself felt wrong, too artificial, too dependent on software decisions, too far removed from what they believe Formula One should represent. That kind of reaction is rare, because drivers usually try to avoid directly attacking the regulations. They know how much money teams invest in developing these cars. They know the sport cannot simply change direction overnight. But after Melbourne, the frustration was impossible to hide. Lando Norris described the situation as chaotic. Max Verstappen called the direction of the regulations anti-racing. And even drivers who were more cautious admitted that the learning curve for these cars could be extremely steep. Inside the paddock, two different opinions are already forming. One group believes the problems seen in Australia are simply part of the adjustment period. A brand new generation of cars. A completely different hybrid system. A racing style that teams and drivers still need to understand. From this perspective, the chaos in Melbourne may disappear once everyone learns how to manage the new technology properly. George Russell hinted at this idea after the race. He suggested that the sport should give the regulations some time before making major judgments, because the first race of a new era is always unpredictable. But there is another group that sees the situation very differently. They believe the chaos in Melbourne revealed deeper problems inside the regulations themselves. Problems that cannot simply be solved with experience. Because if the entire system depends too heavily on energy management, the racing may always feel artificial. And if drivers constantly need to lift off the throttle to recharge batteries, the cars may never deliver the pure driving experience that defines Formula One. That is the challenge now facing the FIA. The organization must protect the long-term technological direction of the sport. But it must also maintain the identity of Formula One as the fastest and most demanding racing category in the world. If that balance is lost, the criticism from drivers will only grow stronger. And once drivers begin openly questioning the direction of the sport, the debate quickly spreads to teams, fans, and manufacturers. Which is why the next few races of the 2026 season could become extremely important. Because if the same problems appear again, if drivers continue reporting chaotic overtakes, if the speed differences remain dangerous, then the pressure on the FIA will increase dramatically. More discussions, more technical meetings, more calls for adjustments to the system. And what started as a controversial race weekend in Melbourne could quickly turn into one of the biggest regulatory debates Formula One has faced in years. Because the 2026 era has just begun. And the question now hanging over the paddock is simple. Did the Australian Grand Prix expose the future of Formula One? Or did it expose a problem that the sport must fix before it goes any further?